At 2:47 p.m., a Ukrainian attack helicopter did something that violated every rule of combat aviation. It plunged straight into the kill zone of a Russian missile crew, flying low and slow as if daring them to fire. The Russians must have thought they'd hit the jackpot. An Mi-24 Hind, bristling with rockets, exposed in broad daylight over a quiet stretch of front. Tactically, it made no sense, unless being seen was the objective. Oleski had been mostly quiet for months, confined to drone clashes and occasional artillery bursts. Yet here was a prized gunship with 4 B-8V rocket pods under its wings, each pod holding 20 S-8 rockets, 80 unguided rounds in all. Those 80mm rockets weigh nearly 12 kilos apiece and carry warheads built to pierce hundreds of millimeters of armor. A helicopter laden with that much ordnance in such a calm sector looked out of place, like a pro showing up to a kid's game. To the Russians, it appeared inexplicable, and that confusion is exactly what made the scene so perilous for them. From about 3.2 kilometers away, a two-man MANPADS crew had been watching the approach through binoculars for several minutes. They manned a 9K-38 Igla system, one of the more capable shoulder-fired air defense weapons in service. Ready to fire, the whole outfit is heavy and awkward, roughly 18 kilograms, with a 1.5-meter missile packing a warhead meant to shred helicopters. But the warhead's explosive power is only part of the threat. At the nose, a cooled infrared seeker represents a major step up from older designs. Lower sensor noise and longer detection ranges, improving the chance of distinguishing exhaust from decoys. The Hind went into its attack dive and dumped its rockets in a long ripple, each projectile streaking at about 610 meters per second and splashing across roughly a 500-meter impact arc. Yet many of the rockets splattered into the Dnipro River. Others struck empty fields and sent mud and water skyward. Only a small number hit buildings. On the surface, it looked like area suppression rather than precise strikes, a seemingly wasteful expenditure of munitions in a quiet sector. But that 500-meter scatter had a second purpose the Russian crew failed to see. Beyond suppressing ground, the wide pattern was ideal for provoking an air defense response. Any MANPADS team watching that messy barrage would feel compelled to engage an apparent easy target. The Russian crew followed their training to the letter. Soviet-era doctrine pressures immediate engagement of aircraft that enter the Igla's envelope. The launcher can engage targets at up to about 800 meters per second and altitudes of a few kilometers. This low, slow helicopter sat well within that envelope. When the gunner aimed northeast, the geometry revealed something significant. The Hind had crossed toward territory under Russian control. From the crew's firing position, the Igla's roughly 5-kilometer reach couldn't even stretch across the river to the helicopter's track. In other words, the Ukrainians were courting danger to make the Russians take the bait. Why would a Ukrainian pilot brazenly expose himself over a sector with known air defense coverage? There was no clear tactical gain in this stretch, no massed troops, and no vital infrastructure needing suppression. So the route looked reckless. That apparent recklessness was intentional. At 2:48 p.m., as the last of the S-8s struck below, the Russian operator squeezed off a shot. The Igla's cooled seeker latched onto the Hind's engine heat, and the missile lit off with a white flare. It accelerated to roughly Mach 1.9, charging toward the target with its infrared seeker maintaining lock despite the afternoon sun. Inside the Hind, the crew's warning panel sang the moment. An SP-015 receiver that scans bands, matches signatures to a huge library, and displays threats on an LED array. The system categorizes threats and generates distinct tones: a steady tone for radar lock, a pulsing tone for launch, and rapid chirps for terminal guidance. In this case, the high-pitched pulsing tone confirmed an IR missile launch, exactly what the crew had been waiting for. The pilot banked hard left, and dumped a precise sequence of 12 infrared flares. The aircraft's dispensers carry scores of flares. This airframe can hold many, each burning above 2,000 degrees Celsius, to mimic engine heat and lure seekers away. The timing was perfect. Below, the rocket impacts had produced heat blooms and fires. Above, the flares blossomed like false suns. Suddenly, the battlefield became a thermal maze. 80 rocket impacts created dozens of ground heat sources that lasted for seconds, while 12 fresh flares lit the sky. The Seeker, designed for simpler engagements, now faced dozens of competing infrared cues. It could not reliably discriminate the helicopter from the many false signatures. It lost lock and reacquired the brightest heat cluster, a patch of burning impacts about 150 meters away. The missile streaked past the hind and detonated harmlessly far from the aircraft. The miss was close enough for the crew to see but too distant for the proximity fuse to matter. That outcome was always part of the plan. The real advantage came from what firing the missile revealed. The launch's thermal and electromagnetic signature pinpointed the origin. Ukrainian signals intelligence systems quickly triangulated the missile plume combined with radio emissions from the crew. Systems now compress targeting timelines dramatically. Where localization once took many minutes, automated processing can produce coordinates in about 90 seconds. By the time that window closed, the strike asset already had a bearing. Here, the data fed straight to an FPV drone operator roughly 8 kilometers away. This tactic flips classic helicopter doctrine. Instead of evading air defenses, Ukrainian pilots bait them, provoking a shot to unmask enemy positions and trusting follow-on sensors to finish the job. It's an acceptance of calculated risk that rewrites traditional employment. Use your aircraft as lure, trust countermeasures, and let remote assets eliminate the defenders. Conventional military minds would call it reckless. In practice, it becomes devastatingly effective. The Russian team, unaware of the trap, began standard post-firing procedures. Disconnect tubes, stow grip stocks, remove expended coolant units, take out thermal batteries, and pack cases. Under ideal conditions, that process takes 4 to 6 minutes. In the river delta's mud, it stretched far longer. Slick stairs, debris, and clinging mud turn routine pack-up into a slog while personnel remain task-fixed. That fixation creates the vulnerability Ukrainian drone crews exploit. During disassembly, crews can't maintain full situational awareness, and that window is what remote operators train to seize. Ukrainian forces operate with distributed authority. SIG-INT nodes feed coordinates directly to empowered drone pilots rather than routing through slow hierarchical approvals. That flat structure shortens decision cycles from tens of minutes to under a few. At 2:49 p.m., the FPV operator received the target and spun up a modified commercial quad, its civilian frame concealing a 1.5-kilogram warhead where a gimbal once sat. The drone climbed, hugging terrain at roughly 50 meters to slip under radars and eyes. Its small plastic frame and electric motors gave it almost no thermal or radar signature, and its audible whine is barely noticeable until it's within a couple of hundred meters. By the time you hear it, it's usually too late. Through the live feed, the operator saw 2 Russian soldiers still wrestling with their nearly 18-kilogram launcher in the mud. The drone's approach minimized detection while maximizing effect. At low altitude, the craft's small radar cross-section and quiet electric drive make it essentially invisible to many conventional sensors. The operator guided the quad to place the warhead precisely between the men and their gear. At 2:55 p.m., 7 minutes after the Igla fired, the crew finally heard the telltale drone whine. Crammed with heavy equipment on slick steps and surrounded by debris, there was no viable escape route. They could only watch as the quad descended. At 2:56 p.m., 8 minutes after the launch, the drone struck, and the 1.5-kilogram charge detonated on impact. The blast removed another launcher that could threaten Ukrainian aircraft. Within hours, the psychological knock-on spread across communications. Engagement orders tightened. Crews were warned not to fire without explicit permission. That caution, born of fear of immediate reprisals, degrades network effectiveness. Hesitation forces operators to weigh survival against duty, and that trade-off gives Ukrainian helicopters more freedom to operate. The calculus of risk had shifted. One missile fired, one launcher destroyed, and a doubt now rippling through every crew watching in the sector. Bye for now.